You are listening to Social Europe podcast. We discuss cutting-edge thinking on politics, economy, and employment and labour with some of the most thought-provoking people around, including Nobel Prize winners and other internationally acclaimed experts. So welcome and enjoy the conversation.
This episode of Social Europe podcast is brought to you by the Said Business School, University of Oxford. Maximize your effectiveness in the changing global business environment with the postgraduate Oxford Diploma in Global Business. Taught in 4 short modules over a year, the program is designed to accelerate your career and increase your impact while minimizing the disruption to your work and family life. Learn alongside senior executives from around the world and develop a lifelong network. Visit the Oxford Diploma in Global Business website to find out more. Okay, Friederike Otto, thank you very much indeed for taking the time today to talk to me about the man-made effects on climate change and what kind of policy responses one would need in order to mitigate these effects. And in order to get this going for those listeners and viewers that are not sort of that up-to-date in climate research, what are your main research findings? So what are the man-made effects on climate, and what kind of links are established?
So the main effect is that because of burning of fossil fuels, we have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that has led to an increase in the global mean temperature. And what my own research is particularly on is what does an increase in global mean temperature mean for our weather? Because global mean temperature doesn't kill anyone directly, but it is through the changing intensity and frequency of weather events, and particularly extreme weather events, that actually climate change manifests. And the research that I'm working on, which is called event attribution, there we are looking at actual extreme weather events that have happened and where we have experienced the effects of these weather events, and find out whether and to what extent climate change played a role in these. So we are currently working on a study on the bushfires in Australia that are going on. I don't have results for that yet. But we have done many studies on heat waves. We have done studies on floods, on so a very prominent one were, for example, the rainfall associated with hurricanes like Hurricane Harvey, where we have seen that because of man-made climate change, the likelihood of the intensity of this intense rainfall that we've seen has increased by a factor of 3. For heat waves, the numbers are quite different. So for the heat waves in Europe that we've looked at, for example, in 2019, so this last summer, there was a heat wave at the end of June in France. And that was made at least 10 times more likely, but the statistical average is more like 100 times more likely. So that's a quite a different order of magnitude. But not all extreme weather events are being made more likely because of climate change. And the reason for that is that there are basically 2 ways how climate change affects weather. So the first one is because we have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we have a higher temperature overall. And so that means a higher temperature overall is that we have an increased risk of heat waves, a decreased risk of cold waves, and also a warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor, and that has to get out of the atmosphere as well. So on an average, we also see more extreme rainfall events. But because we have changed the composition of the atmosphere, having more greenhouse gases and more water vapor in there, that also affects the atmospheric circulation, which means where weather systems develop, how they develop, and how they move. And this second effect is very different depending on the region and the season and the type of weather event. So you can have that both effects go in the same direction. So you have more extreme rainfall because of warming, but you also get more low pressure systems that bring in rainfall. And so the overall effect is that you have a stronger increase in extreme precipitation than you would expect just from the warming alone. But it can also be in the other way around, that either you have, in principle, an increase in rainfall because of the warming, but you get a bit fewer rain-bringing weather systems, and so these two effects can cancel each other out. So when you just look at the weather data, you don't see any change. Or it can be that if you want, the dynamics win, so that you have, it can rain as much as it wants on a global average, but if you do not get the weather that can bring in rain, then you just don't get any rain, and you actually see a drying trend. And because these effects have a relatively complicated interplay depending on region to region, you can't say for actually when you are making decisions about a city or about a smaller scale county or so, you can't just look at the average projections of how the climate is changing, but you would actually need to look at find out what am I vulnerable to, what is my city vulnerable to, and then when you know that, it might be extreme rainfall, it might be heat waves, it might be droughts, it might be all of it together. Then you can say, okay, and for these kind of events that I'm vulnerable to, how has climate change already affected this kind of weather, and how will it change into the future?
So if I understand you correctly, the mechanism and the interplay between these two mechanisms that you describe basically show that, first of all, you have to really look at microclimates, so really localized sort of weather systems, rather than a global average or anything like that. And is this also the mechanism that would explain why some people say, look, I mean, it got colder here rather than warmer, so how there couldn't be global warming? So the effects are felt very differently in different places.
So I think there is a bit, there's also a bit of perception bias going on, I think, depending on what you're sensitive to. But for specific weather types, you really have to look you don't have to look at microclimates, which usually means really on the centimeter scale, but more on the local and regional climates. So tens of kilometers rather than hundreds of kilometers, which is usually what you look at when you look at global projections. The effect of climate change is very different in different parts of the world on the same type of extreme events. So, for example, we have looked at droughts in East Africa and droughts in South Africa. And while we find that in South Africa, there is a strong increase in the likelihood of drought because of climate change, we don't see the same thing in East Africa. So there actually climate change does not seem to play a big role in the likelihood of droughts in East Africa. And that certainly has something to do with the different in circulation and how the circulation is affected by climate change differently. But also there's another very important aspect, that whether or not a weather system or a weather event turns into a disaster strongly depends on vulnerability and exposure. And so a good example is a drought we have analyzed with colleagues in Sao Paulo that affected Sao Paulo in 2014, and it had massive impacts. So there was huge water shortages and outbreak of cholera and so on. And we looked at the drought and found that from a meteorological point of view, it was not very extreme. It was about a 1 in 10 year event. And also there was no change in the hazard, so no change in the likelihood of such a drought to occur. So climate change did not make it more or less likely. But then we also looked at, okay, what else has changed? And we looked at population increase in the area, which had increased, but moderately. But then we looked also at the water usage, and that had increased exponentially in the last 10 years. And so a drought that actually happened in a very similar way at the beginning of the noughties and also in the 70s and had moderate impacts had a massive impact in 2014 because of this exponential increase in water usage, which had nothing to do with the weather at all, and also nothing with climate change. And I think that is really important not to forget that what is the context and how are other factors changing that turn weather into disaster.
And that's an interesting segue to my next question. I mean, you already mentioned the carbon in the atmosphere, and that's the main driver for climate change. But are there other factors that are driving man-made climate change? And also, are there, as you just mentioned, with the exponential increase in water usage, are there commonly found in your research other factors such as these that are contributing factors to making droughts and other weather events worse?
Yeah. So first of all, there are so the biggest problem with climate change and why climate change is such a threat is CO2. CO2 is, and the reason for that is that CO2, just once it has been emitted into the atmosphere, it basically stays there forever. So it has a very, very long lifetime. So every CO2 molecule that is in the stratosphere, that will stay there for hundreds of years. Whereas other greenhouse gases, which are also important, like methane, for example, has a lifetime of decades, but not so in the short term. It's a very powerful greenhouse gas and accelerates the warming, but it doesn't have such a long lifetime, and therefore it will not be in the atmosphere forever, which also makes accounting of different greenhouse gases quite difficult because they have these different lifetimes. But then apart from greenhouse gases that lead to warming, the burning and human activities also emit other things. And the main one is aerosols, so small particles into the atmosphere. And these aerosols have, depending on the size of the particles and depending on the particles itself, they also have different effects. So if it's soot, for example, that also has a warming effect. But sulfate aerosols, and we know that from volcanic eruptions, we see that very strongly when we look, for example, at global temperature records. You see that after big volcanic eruptions like Pinatubo in 1991, you see a big drop in the global temperature for about a year or two because these sulfate aerosols have a cooling effect. So they reflect the sunlight, and less sunlight reaches the earth. But not only volcanoes emit aerosols, but also burning of fossil fuels also emit aerosols. And we have we know the smog problems in cities like Beijing or Delhi. So that is mainly through aerosols, and that is they have a much shorter lifetime, so they usually stay in the atmosphere for, depending on how high they get, for weeks and then rain out. But because they are constantly emitted, they also have a strong effect on the weather. And actually, we have done studies on heat waves in India and found that there the effect from the aerosols is as big as the effect from the greenhouse gases. So that the aerosols are currently masking the warming from the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we don't see as strong an increase in the temperatures as we would expect because of the aerosols. But of course, the problems with the aerosols are so big in terms of health issues that you wouldn't say, well, then we just keep the aerosols and so we are safe from global warming, but the health problems are actually much, much worse from the aerosols. But so when the air is cleaned up, then we will quite likely see a big jump in the heat wave risk in that area. So that's just something you need to take into account when making plans for how to manage the city.
Yeah, and your example for Sao Paulo seems to suggest that there are also social changes that are drivers. I mean, urbanization cannot really be attributed to this particular example because you say the population number hasn't changed very much, but probably there must have been some sort of lifestyle change if the water usage has increased exponentially, even though the population hasn't increased to the same extent.
Yeah, and I, in this particular example, I don't know the reasons for that, but that can be. So yes, actually, to answer the second part of your question, there are also other things that have nothing to do with the burning of fossil fuels that and not anything to do with the weather event itself, but with how vulnerable we are or how exposed we are to weather events that that are very important. And so water usage is one of them. But also there are things like you mentioned urbanization. So whether or not a heat wave is happening in a city or over a forest strongly also influences how hot or how intense the temperatures will be, because when you have a concrete surface, then the warming, you have this heat island effect where the warming gets exacerbated because of the surface. Whereas if you had the same weather event over a forest, it would not get as hot as it is in the city. So what that the land use, how the land is used, plays an important role. And also a forest can keep, because it has trees and that they have deeper roots and they keep the water in the ground much better as if you just have agriculture. So that also has effects on droughts and heat waves itself. So that is also a very important factor. So it's always so every extreme weather event is unique from if you absolutely boil down to them, because of all the you have the variability in the weather just because of the chaotic nature of the weather system, but you also have all these other influences. But that doesn't mean that the likelihood and intensity of extreme weather events is not influenced by external drivers like climate change. So you will never say that climate change is the only cause of an extreme weather event, but it can play a big or a small role. So in many cases, though, it's one factor of many.
And it's an interesting point that you mentioned. Presumably, the surface does not just play a role in heat waves, but with floods as well. Presumably, if you have concreted over areas, the water cannot dissipate as quickly. So in many respects, the tendency to urbanize, just because of the type of land use, is exacerbating the potential effect of such weather events.
Yes, it is, and I think it is also when you think about policy responses to so of course when we talk about climate change and policy responses, we usually talk about mitigation, so about limiting emissions, or limiting emissions to net zero, which is what we have to do to stop climate temperatures from increasing. But what is equally important is to also talk about adaptation, because the climate has already changed. We have already more than 1 degree of temperature increase since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and that we see that heat waves in Europe have increased by orders of magnitude in the likelihood, and the numbers are smaller for other types of extreme events, but that still has a huge impact. So we need also to take adaptation very seriously, and because heat waves are the type of extreme event where climate change is really the biggest game changer, that is also a really important thing to think about when adapting. And one way of doing that is to change the structure of our cities, because to have more green spaces, because that not only makes the city a nicer place to live in, but really actually keeps the temperature lower in the city.
And before we get to the adaptation part, which I think is important, because that kind of policy area is playing second fiddle, if anything at all. But if we stay with the mitigation attempts, at the beginning of the policy discussion, where do you see the current effort, where current efforts are? I mean, obviously the Paris Agreement is the centerpiece of policy responses, but it's very much under pressure, not least since the United States decided to leave the agreement. So where do you see the current state of play in terms of mitigation attempts?
Yeah. So I think the Paris Agreement is extremely important because it clearly says that what we have to do, and we have to limit global emissions, global net emissions of greenhouse gases to zero, to stop temperatures from rising further, and it also gives a clear goal of what temperature we want to aim for. So that is crucially important. What, of course, is missing so far is the next step to actually achieve that by putting the pledges, by first of all, so an important component of why we actually achieved the Paris Agreement, so that at the time all the parties agreed to it, was because it is a bottom-up approach. So every country can pledge how much they reduce their emissions by when. So there is no magic global entity that tells the country what they have to do, but they all do that themselves. And then there is this so-called stock take. So every 5 years, it will be looked at how the pledges match with the goals, and then the idea is that then the countries will increase their ambitions. At the moment, the pledges that we have are not enough to actually achieve the goal. So we need to increase the ambition, and in particularly the Paris Agreement also says that the Annex 1 countries, so the most developed countries, that they should lead and they should be the most ambitious. So clearly, the Europe has a very central role here to play. Of course, the US as well, but also I think Europe has a very, very important role to play, and big countries like Germany, they have to show that you can do this, and they have to show ambition, which they are not doing at the moment. So that is one aspect. But then, of course, the pledges are one thing, but to actually then achieve what you have pledged as a country, you need to have legislation that allows these pledges and your goals to be achieved. And that step is something that is crucially missing at the moment. That in a country like the UK, we have a net zero aim, a net zero goal by 2050. But there are still houses being built that are not passive houses at all. And so this step from actually, and it's a very, very important step to have the goals and the aims, but then that needs to be followed up with legislation quickly so that investors have foreseeability and know what they are doing. So investors, when I talk to people in the finance sector, they say, well, we want these legislation. We want them now, and we want them to be as long term as possible, so that we know what we have to build our businesses around. And so that is where it's really too slow at the moment.
And that pretty much also answers my next question. I mean, if there are any good examples, any countries that are are showing the way for where policy learning can actually take place. But if I understand you correctly, pretty much everywhere, including both of our home country Germany and the UK and everywhere else, all the countries that ought to show the way and lead the way, the pledges have not been met by a realistic policy course of action.
Well, at least not all the way through. I think that the UK has shown quite a bit of leadership in that. I hope, and I wouldn't. It's not too late that they could actually show also go all the next steps. But I think what is really important also to realize is that the problem is so big that we can't wait for every last Trump in this world to to do something on a national level, but where very important things are happening and need to happen also more intensely is on different scales. So city scales, on state levels, and we see that happening in in the U.S. California has joined in the emission trading scheme and so on. And I think that I'm a hopeless optimist. So I think through these efforts on other scales, the national scales, and seeing that actually reducing emissions and achieving net zero is not something that is excruciatingly expensive, but that it is something that in many ways actually leads to new business ideas, and also making life better for a lot of people. I think that's also an important aspect that we are missing in the conversation at the moment. The conversation is always about, oh, you have to give up this, you have to give up that, you can't eat meat. But actually, while of course there are things we need to change, and change is always difficult, a lot of the things that we have to change are actually good. They make our cities much nicer places to live in if we have more green space, if we don't have cars, and they make us healthier, and that is a really good thing. And so I think we need to get better on that aspect of telling the story. Of course, it's not all great, and there are things we have to do that will not make everyone happy. But there are also a lot of things that are really good, and especially for the I think when we look at the younger generations, that things that seem completely impossible when you look at some ongoing policy dialogue or discussions are completely normal for younger people. So that is also an important thing that we as sort of influencers or whoever need to get better at.
And if you talk about the innovation part of this, I mean, the interesting discussion at the moment in Germany under the framework of industrial policy is what kind of role technology or technological innovation can play in trying to mitigate some of these effects. You already mentioned that, once carbon is in the atmosphere, there's literally no way to get it out. So would you see, I mean, is there a technical way to get carbon out of the atmosphere? And if not, I mean, the carbon capture technology or some sort of technological advance, what is actually feasible and what is basically lazy argument for saying, for kicking the can down the road? So where can innovation and industrial policy play a role, and where is it just wishful thinking?
So carbon capture so if you have a coal-fired power plant, and at the emission place works, so you can capture the carbon and put it underground. So that works. That has been shown on smaller scales. It hasn't been tried at scale, and it will probably be an important aspect to get to net zero, because there are things that are excruciatingly difficult to do without emitting CO2. Flying, for example, is one of them. But we can't to use that to think that will be the only thing we do, and keep doing everything else as before. That won't work. And so concentrating on that is, I think, very dangerous. And that has been done for the last 30 years, that people have said, oh yeah, but we will get technological innovation and then we'll solve the problem. And it hasn't happened so far, and it will get hotter and hotter if we keep on having this same argument. So while I think it is important to invest at larger scale on carbon capture and storage, it is much more important to also to really seriously decarbonize all the things where we know how to do it. Like we know how to how to travel not in the air but on the ground without emitting, without internal combustion engines. And we know how to build passive houses and these kind of things that are not done yet. So I think focusing on doing the things that we know how to do is really important.
And that gets us also nicely into the mitigation area as well. You already mentioned that the composition of cities ought to change. So you cannot have everything concreted over. You need green spaces, which also as a side product makes it a city much nicer place to live in for people and children. But what are the other things that you would say are needed in terms of sort of adapting to the realities?
So one thing that is also actually important for the mitigation is that to build houses in a well insulated way. So not only that you have to heat them less, but also that you don't have to cool them down in the summer. So I think the focus on heat waves is at this point in time really important, because that is where climate change is the game changer. So the type of heat waves that we see in the summers, in particular in Europe, is very different to what we've been used to in the past. And so that is something where a big focus needs to be on. And there are also while changing the houses and changing how our cities look like is obviously something that you don't do in 1 year. That takes a few years, or a few more years. But there are also things that you can do immediately, which are important. And on the one hand is that just to raise awareness that heat waves are dangerous, and just to tell people what they have to do in a heat wave, that you have to drink water, that you don't go running around in the midday heat, and so which is what is called a heat action plan. And now, so in 2003, when we had a very big heat wave here in Europe, people didn't know that. And there was just no communication about the dangers of heat wave. And so there were 70,000 people died that summer in Europe. And then a few years later, 2006, with the center over France, there was another big heat wave. And then cities like Paris had a heat action plan, and they just informed people there's a heat wave coming, see where you have places where you can go to cool down, just open public buildings so that people can go in there to cool down, just give out water, have water fountains, and so on. So these very simple things is also something that we just have to do. And also in other parts of the world, so in Andhra Pradesh, in India, it has been shown to have a huge effect on the number of people affected by heat waves if you just do these very simple things. And then, of course, there are other types of events where we have more extreme rainfall in the winter in Northern Europe, for example. So there's a higher risk of flooding, that again is mainly a building issue, that you need to have floodplains without houses so that the water can go somewhere. And so these are things that again are not, you can't do overnight, but it's also something that can be done.
Yeah, but interestingly, I mean, in the area of policy learning, there doesn't seem to be a lot of learning, especially if you look at the housing stock. They're actually well proven financial incentive agendas, like the KfW in Germany, for instance. I mean, I'm sitting in a passive house that I built 2 years ago on the outskirts of Berlin, and there were financial incentives to build according to these standards. And in the UK, the discussion about a public investment bank has been going on for the best part of 2 decades now, without any kind of impact. So do you see any sort of opportunities to accelerate the kind of dissemination of best practice?
I think, well, I don't really want to open that kind of worms, but I think I will do now anyway. There's always quite often when we talk about climate change and what to do about it, there is the broad brush capitalism critique coming with it. And there are a lot of people who say we can't have capitalism and solve climate change. And I wouldn't go that far, because we have actually seen that we can, at least to a degree, decouple rising emissions and economic growth. We have not shown that we can that works for the globe, but I wouldn't say we also have no reason to say it's impossible. But I think one aspect of how capitalism is implemented or is happening that is really problematic is lobbyism. So we see that in Germany with the car industry, and we see that in Britain with the housing industry, where in Britain you have very few companies who basically own the whole housing market, and so they have a huge amount of power. And I think if we do not get these lobby groups realizing that it's in their best interest to do something that is really limiting global warming to not more than 2 degrees, then we won't go very far.
Yeah, I mean, the decoupling and the degrowth debate is probably, it's a kind of worms for another day, but it's an interesting one. I mean, I personally also see no particular reason. I mean, GDP is just a measure of output, right? So, and if output is more service-based, and, you know, if you go somewhere to the city and give a talk and they pay you for this, that's adding to GDP. And, you know, you're not emitting any more carbon than you would otherwise, right? So that you're doing nothing other than being there and talking. So the type of economic activity, if you move away from production towards services, is an important factor.
Yeah. So I think we definitely have to talk about the way of how we understand capitalism. But I don't want to talk about abandoning capitalism completely.
Yeah, no. How you structure the economy, how value is created, how, you know, what does GDP measure well, what doesn't it measure well? You know, that discussion needs to be had. I mean, absolutely no doubt about this. But I think I still haven't found any sort of structural argument why economic growth, as measured in GDP, you know, if you go down into what it actually measures and what the value actually is that is denominated in money. Why it does have to contribute to the worsening of the climate. So there seems to be no necessary connection. In reality, there are obviously many connections, but in theory, I mean, you could probably have both. But we already been going for 35 minutes, and let me ask you the same set of questions I always ask at the end. If you were a policymaker and you had to prioritize your agenda as well, what would your top 3 priorities be? And maybe in the case of this particular subject, you might also want to attribute to certain government levels. So you mentioned that, you know, on the state level, such as in California, you could do things if the national government is not playing ball. But maybe also in Europe, there's a new commission now taking up its working agenda, and the Green New Deal is apparently very high up there. So what would you see as the top 3 priorities from a policy standpoint that should be tackled, and where would you want this to be tackled at?
So I think one thing that would be my top priority is actually quite far away from everything that we just talked about, and going back to what we talked at the beginning, and that is to really connect climate policy and development policy, and because that is not connected at all at the moment, not even on the adaptation side. So that, and I think that, and really very much increase also the budget for if you ask me about EU level and nation level in the EU, then that would be to really increase the budget and the effort and the intellectual capacity that goes into development work and linking that with climate work. That would be my top priority, because it is not it's not us sitting here in, well, this is not exactly a passive house being in the UK, but it's not the rich developed country people who are paying for the impact of climate change, but it's the most vulnerable people, and the most vulnerable people globally, but also the most vulnerable people within every society that are paying for the impacts of climate change. And so, and that is why we actually, and because it affects people and it affects livelihoods, is why we care about the climate. And I think without having a very serious effort on that, realizing that and doing something about it, we will not actually really address the problem. So that will be my top priority. And I think on the other, another priority would be, and I am not a policymaker, probably for a reason, because you find out when you do it that it's much more difficult than you think it should be, would be to really follow through with legislation to the pledges on the things where we know how to do it. So that would really target the sectors where we know how we can decarbonize them. And so in the UK, that would be a big focus on the housing market and transport. And in other countries, I would need to do some research, or I would hopefully have a big team that would do the research and really see where can we have the biggest difference, and really show examples. I think that would be a thing that is important to show on a city or on a county scale examples of a carbon neutral city or a carbon neutral county very soon, to show that it actually works.
Yeah, and probably you need to present and work on good examples, for instance, in areas that are changing economic structures. I mean, in Germany we had a discussion about exiting brown coal mining, which is absolutely necessary, but at the same time you need to show how these areas that were economically and socially dependent for a long time on this activity can be rejuvenated in a different fashion, and only then I think you can set a good example. So when it worked in the Lausitz, that the next door neighbors in Poland might think, okay, well, we are part of this problem as well, and they did it successfully next door.
I was going to say, in Poland is actually the good example, but
yeah, we can, the emulation of of best practice and actually finding best practice.
Yeah.
Okay, Friederike, thank you very much indeed. This was a fascinating conversation, and I think one that a lot of policymakers need to take more to heart. I mean, the trade-offs in policymaking will always have to be made, but the response so far has been woefully inadequate. And I hope we can make a little contribution towards raising awareness that this has been too little, but hopefully not too late. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you don't miss future episodes by subscribing to Social Europe Podcast. You can also read our articles on www.socialeurope.eu and follow us on Facebook and on Twitter @Social Europe. Until next time.